You're watching City Channel 4, your window to our community. We're very excited to have Paul here today. He's a rather modest man. He has a BA in history from the University of Iowa. He also was a high school guidance counselor for many years and was guidance counselor of the year at one point. So he's very successful in his career. After he retired, and even for a while he was still working, he started to create the Brushy Creek Press. And this is the output of the Brushy Creek Press. And I must compliment Paul on a couple of very important studies he's done, particularly on the life of Grant Wood. This one investigates Grant Wood's last summer up in Clear Lake in 1941. Paul asked questions no one else asked. He hunted down the elderly people in the community and retrieved those stories before they were lost. So all the scholars of Grant Wood are very grateful for Paul illuminating that particular chapter of Grant Wood's life. But you can see he's done imagery relating to historic Dubuque, historic Clear Lake. He did a wonderful series on the Lincoln grandchildren and also on the Vinnie Ream, who designed the Kirkwood statue that's now up at Kirkwood College in Cedar Rapids. So I invite you to peruse these books later on after our talk and get an idea of some of the things that Paul's been up to. We're really kind of circling back in history today. If you can imagine 1961 and this building has just opened up. You've seen those goofy Army surplus metal desks down there? Well, that's how the reading room was lined up. And one of our visitors was McKinley Kantor. So I'm going to pass this photograph around, and he's working with Dr. Steamboat Bill Peterson here on his Spirit Lake book. So this reiterates our theme that our lectures tend to be based on people who've done research in this building using our collections, and that's why we host these. We've also laid out a few other photographs of McKinley Kantor that appear in our photograph collection. But we're very pleased to have Paul here today. He's a native of Webster City. He's very proud of being an Iowan. And he knew the people and the places that were associated with McKinley Kantor's childhood. And so let's give Paul a big round of applause and welcome him here today.
Well, it's nice to see all of you out here today, that's for sure. And I'd like to thank Mary for her kind words. You know, I really can't tell you how important Mary Bennett has been to me over the years, both professionally and personally. Certainly without her, I would not be standing here in front of you today. Her encouragement for the past 30 years has been a stimulus for me for my work and I know the work of many, many other people. This facility here on Iowa Avenue and the work of all of the librarians that have been employed here, they continue to encourage researchers to seek and preserve Iowa's history. Now, it's true that a lot can be done with computers in today's world of research, but so many times I've found that the human element is so important. It's that person that can turn you on to a concept or a direction that can answer questions for you. There's an old saying that people who don't know history are like leaves without a tree. And it's here in a spot like this that research can take place that gives us all that basic foundation for our historical interests. Well, let me tell you some things about Webster City, Iowa. Webster City is in north central Iowa. It's in Hamilton County, and that's kind of neat because, of course, Hamilton is being talked about a lot these days, isn't it? It is a rather unique situation there because the high school in this town of about 8,000 people has produced 2 Pulitzer Prize winning authors. One of them was Clark Mollenhoff, and Clark Mollenhoff received the Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting. And the other is a man that I will be talking about today, the novelist McKinley Kantor. McKinley Kantor was born in Webster City on February 4th, 1904, and he died in Sarasota, Florida on October 11th, 1977. He received his Pulitzer in 1956, so that's exactly 60 years ago this year, if I'm figuring that right. And he received it for the Civil War novel about the infamous prison called Andersonville. And many people have said that the two novels of the 20th century that captured the Civil War the most were Gone with the Wind and Andersonville. Kantor also produced over 40 novels. He wrote for several national magazines of the time, and he created numerous screenplays too. Well, I'm going to put some things in McKinley Kantor's words to begin, because once he was asked about his writing, and this is what he said. This is McKinley Kantor speaking. He said, "Call the towns what you will, or what I did call them. Clay City, Sheldrake, Mahaska Falls, North Bend, Eagle Falls. They're always Webster City. I see the community I usually loved, but sometimes hated, before me as I write. Oh, Elm City, Hartfield, Lexington, Ridgeport, Hickory, they were replete with their Wilson Avenues and Second Streets. Rock River, Kewassee, Platteville, Minnehaha, Hartsdale, may Providence smile upon them and upon the folks that used to dwell there and the new ones that have come." Well, during my high school days, the novelist McKinley Kantor came out with a big sweeping novel that he called Spirit Lake. And I was a young high school journalist student at that time, and I was entranced because he talked about many places in the beginning of the book Spirit Lake, the novel Spirit Lake, that were really places that I was familiar with, places around my rural Webster County home. And quickly, very quickly, Kantor became one of my personal heroes. I really liked his powerful use of language. It was kind of rough and tumble, and his use of dialects from an earlier time, and he even wove in some Native American dialects. And each word I knew was carefully chosen and seemed to me to be very masculine and very defined. Yet, even with that, there was always kind of a dreamlike quality to his prose. He could make characters into the people that I felt I knew. And as is the case with any great novelist, I guess, he engaged all of the senses as he wrote. I could see the characters. I could hear their voices. I could taste the food and drink he was talking about. And I could smell their surroundings. Some of his passages, truthfully, could break my heart in the novels I was reading, while others certainly could lift my spirits. And added to this, of course, was a powerful emotion of pride. I was really proud that he came from my hometown and had graduated from my high school in the very building that I was attending. I'd always wanted to know more about his life as I grew up in Webster City. I dreamed, most certainly I dreamed, that someday people might enjoy words as a journalist student that I too might write about him. So the small book I created, and I think it's maybe down here, and this is the cover of it that's on the screen. It's not a biography of McKinley Kantor, but rather the interactions of McKinley Kantor with the hometown over the 73 years of his life. And it also speaks to the legacy that remains in Webster City of McKinley Kantor. Whenever you put together something in this nature, you think first about your audience, and I knew that I wanted to write something as a former resident that would the people of Webster City would want to read. All local people or people with connection to this town were to be my audience. And throughout the book, I called McKinley Kantor by the name that he was known as in Webster City, Mack, and that's what everybody called him. Well, the next task, of course, was to research and write about these topics, but also to find images and photographs that might interest the reader. Unlike the times in which McKinley Kantor wrote, I've found with all of the books that I've done that many of today's readers are much more visual. Photographs certainly stimulate the historical imagination, and in this book about McKinley Kantor, there's 116 photographs. They tell their own story, I think, many times, and so I like to use them in my work. It's one of the reasons I use spiral-bound books, too, because with photographs, it's nice to be able to lay those flat and to really get a look at them. Well, I journeyed because most of McKinley Kantor's materials are at the Library of Congress, so I went to Washington, D.C., and researched there. I also got material from here at the State Historical Society, here in Iowa, also in Florida, and certainly many newspapers. Some of the stories also came from Mack's autobiographical novel that he wrote that was called But Look the Morn. And his son, Tim Kantor, also wrote a novel called My Father's Voice. I guess I would encourage any of you listening to me today to think about writing about any hometown hero that you might have. As I wrote in this book, and these are my words, I wrote, until the end of his life, McKinley Kantor listened for the compliments and hoped for the applause, and it was especially important when it came from his hometown. And I think that's probably true of all of us, isn't it? The cover I chose was a postcard, and that postcard came from about 1905, so it would have been roughly the time that McKinley Kantor was born. And many of the images you'll see here are from that time period, too. It was taken from the cupola of the Hamilton County Courthouse, and it was looking down at more the retail business of the town. This is a house at 1627 Wilson Avenue where McKinley Kantor was born. As I said, he was born on February 4th, 1904. He and his mother and father were living in Chicago just prior to his birth. There were many problems in the marriage, and his mother, Effie, brought her 4-year-old daughter, Virginia, back to her parents' home for his birth. And there'll be more, I'll tell you more about that relationship later on. They were living here temporarily. The grandparents were Effie's mother and father, so there were 3 generations living in the house. But for the most part, this was the house that McKinley Kantor always called home. He considered this home and lived in this home off and on until he was about 20 years or 22 years old. It was always where he called home. Wilson Avenue in Webster City would be in some ways similar to Summit Street here in Iowa City. Closer to the retail district, lots of beautiful large homes. But as the street ran south into the countryside, the homes became much, much more modest. And this, as you can see, was a very modest home. The family always struggled for money, all 3 generations at that time. Here is McKinley Kantor's mother. Her name was Effie, and her grandparents were Adam and Evelyn McKinley. And they had moved into Webster City in 1889. Her family background, the McKinleys, were milling people, and they had owned several mills south of Webster City. The family names of her mother, or Effie's mother, were Bone and Bryan, very old American family. Effie had graduated from Webster City High School in 1898, and then she went to Drake University in Des Moines. Now that seems kind of odd to us sometimes because we think of Drake University as a private school, maybe an expensive school, we might think. But to know a little bit about the background of Drake is that it started out, many of the professors and the students were actually at a school called Oskaloosa College that was having financial difficulties. It was affiliated with the Church of Christ. And then money was offered to move to Des Moines, and many of the faculty and many of the students came to Des Moines. So the Church of Christ, people that attended that denomination, many of their students would look to go to Drake because it was felt to be a good spot for them. Well, while Effie was at Drake University, she met a young man named Jon Kantor, and they married a year later in 1899. Shortly after that, they had a daughter who they named Virginia, but then Jon Kantor deserted Effie and actually went to Minneapolis for a period of time with another woman. Lots of problems involved with him personally. He had a lot of talents, though. I don't like to talk down Jon Kantor in some ways because he was a skilled orator, had a marvelous voice, very charming and personable, but he was also a womanizer and a swindler. So those balances were never legitimate, I guess. He had been born in Sweden and had come to America as a teenager, so he had a Swedish language ability, and that allowed him to swindle a lot of farmers in southern Minnesota and northern Iowa because he could speak their language. For a while, he pretended to be a Jew who had become a Christian, and so the Church of Christ opened up their doors to him, and he survived, I guess is the best way to say it, with that pretense. His parents continued to live in Chicago. This is the little family. Whoops, I'm sorry, I slipped in a one there. This is Bones Mill, which was south of Webster City, and this is where Effie was born. And this is the young family. In about 1910, so Mack Kantor there would have been about 6 years old at that time. Later, and this is, of course, his sister Virginia and Effie. Later, he said that all of those clothing had been given to them. They were all hand-me-downs. And he said that the hat he was wearing he thought was about 5 sizes too large. But Effie knew the power of words, and she encouraged both of her children to be good readers. Later on, Virginia would graduate from Drake herself, and Mack never graduated from college, but he loved the written word and was constantly practicing his own vocabulary. Now, these are the two main, at that point, the two main school buildings in Webster City. The front one there was called North Building, and that was where the high school was located when Mack was in the elementary, and that building behind it is called the South Building. That's where all of the elementary grades were. This was all part of a courthouse square that included also a beautiful park. Well, during those years that Mack was at the South Building, there were some special events in his life that seemed to help direct him. One of those was when President Taft came to Webster City for Watermelon Days, it was called. And this was in 1911. And Mack remembered it and talked a lot about being excused from school, being able to go down and hear President Taft's talk. There was a huge crowd in Webster City of about 20,000 people. The governor of Iowa, who was Governor Carroll at that time, made this following statement. Governor Carroll said, "We were met in Council Bluffs by the hundreds, in Fort Dodge by the thousands, and in Webster City by the acres." Of course, Taft at that time was campaigning for the 1912 election. That was the one in which former President Theodore Roosevelt created a third party, the Bull Moose Party, and that kind of split the Republican Party, and the Democratic candidate at that time, Woodrow Wilson, was elected president. Another adventure for the family was a trip to Clear Lake. Of course, Mack had never been on a train, and that's the way they got to Clear Lake. And he wrote about feeling that vacations and trips to Clear Lake, that was for the wealthier families. A family like his family shouldn't have that opportunity. But of course, he was very happy to go. And here you see Mack is on the right-hand side with a young friend of his. And they stayed in this cottage. This cottage was later bought by another Webster City family, the McMurray family, whose grandson, Tom McMurray, is a lawyer here in town. And they owned it for nearly 100 years until about 2 years ago. And at that time, the cottage was torn down and replaced now with a multi-million-dollar lake home, that's for sure. Another influence on Mack was the Boy Scouts. And this was his own Boy Scout booklet. It's kind of a laminated cover, and I found that at the Library of Congress in some of his materials. At that time, and speaking of the McMurrays, the man that led the Boy Scout troop was a man named Murray McMurray, and he became the leader. He had been a banker there in Webster City. And Murray McMurray was a very influential man, of masculine influence for Mack as he grew up. I mentioned the courthouse where the cover had been taken from this very cupola, and in the background would be both that north building and south building, the two main school buildings in the town. And Mack, in growing up, I mentioned the Church of Christ. He knew his Bible very well. He used passages from the Bible frequently, and that's probably a credit to the three churches that he was a part of. Now, when he was in high school, he drifted towards the Congregational Church as his church of choice. For a period of time, too, the family attended the Baptist Church, mainly because after all of the problems Effie and John had, there was a lot of talking about that problem, and Effie had sought out another church. But the original one, the one that the family spent the most time with, was the Church of Christ. And his grandfather was even on the building committee of this particular church. And this would have been the church that would have helped support Effie going off to Drake University. During those summer years, too, Effie loved butterflies and she loved birds, and so did Mack. And so occasionally they would go to an area right north of Webster City. This is a picture of their tent and Mack's bicycle, and they would spend sometimes a week or two camped out, just enjoying nature. Mack had a large collection of butterflies and moths. This tent was 12 by 14, so it was large, and this area now developed, unfortunately, but it was a beautiful area full of birds and hardwood trees. Mack said once that although he had not gone to college, Kendall Young Library in Webster City was his university. It's a beautiful building. If you've ever visited Webster City, you want to make sure you stop by the library. Actually, the cornerstone on this building is 1904, the very same year that McKinley Kantor was born. He was just a little tyke when he walked up those steps to check out books. And a woman, this is an interior view, Charlotte Crosley, she was also an important person, recommending books to the young boy, the ones that she thought he would enjoy and learn from. She was the one even that established the children's department in the library. This is Mack as a young man. He always loved dogs, and he had a dog for most all of his life. He would write about his dogs or the dogs of friends, and I read one story that I really enjoyed. It was about a dog named Debuco, and Debuco was owned by a man who had a restaurant in Webster City. And the man told him once that he went up to a little lake called Little Wall Lake in the northern part of Hamilton County, and the dog disappeared. And he never saw the dog again. And the restaurant owner said, based on the dog's rather nasty disposition, that he thought the devil probably swooped down and got the dog. And this was a high school building then. The north building had been torn down. So this was a new building at the time Mack attended it. He did not attend it for all 4 years because he spent a portion of the time. His mother tried to reconcile with the father in Chicago, so he was in Chicago for a period of time. He also attended parts of his high school in North High School in Des Moines. In both cases, in Chicago and at North, he dropped out of school. So finally, he came back to Webster City, where he felt comfortable, and this was his building. It's a building that is gone now. It was taken down in the 1980s. This rare view is an interior of that same building. About the time it was built, a man whose son had died in Montana, he was a young lawyer, donated this large statue of Abraham Lincoln, and it appeared in the assembly room of the high school. Now, at the time I attended high school, they had moved that statue outside, and it still stands in front of Webster City High School, the present Webster City High School on the west edge of town. Because of this, many people that went to Webster City, rather than saying they attended Webster City High School, they'll say I attended Lincoln High School. At the time schools were choosing nicknames, they chose a nickname of Lynx based upon the Lincoln High School. And this was Mack's graduation picture, trying to look the way he wanted to look, I'm sure. He graduated with the high school class of 1923, and I'm sure he liked this sophisticated look. He was 19 years old, and there was a class of 58 that graduated at that time. During the summer following his graduation, a group of his fellow students, there were 7 or 8 of them, went for a drive. They had a picnic supper out in the countryside, and they went for a drive to a town called Lehigh, which is in Webster County. It's hard to get down. It's along the Des Moines River, and it's a winding road going down, and they had a bad automobile accident. And Mack was the worst injured. He had a compound fracture in his leg that really for most of his life would not heal. It would ooze after many operations. Took a long time for it to eventually heal. Well, Mack was recuperating at home in Webster City then. He had graduated from high school. His leg was such that he really couldn't move on. But at that time there was a national news story about a man named Floyd Collins. And Floyd Collins was he enjoyed being in caves, and he was from Kentucky. He became trapped, and this is Floyd Collins, became trapped in the cave. And there was a lot of press concerning his rescue, but he eventually died in the cave. And so Mack was moved by that, and he sat down and he wrote a poem, a prose poem, about this event that had happened in February 1925. And it hit the big time. Chicago people had heard about it, and he was asked to come into Chicago to WGN and read the poem. And he did, and he fell in love with the big city and with Chicago, and he thought, this is where I'm going to pursue my vocation, and this is where I want to live. Well, he didn't get right into any type of, although he was always writing, he had to take many other jobs. But it was during that time in Chicago that he met the love of his life, and her name was Irene Lane. And just 3 months after they met, Mack and Irene were married. Now, this was one of those little kiosk photos you recognize. They certainly had their challenges in terms of their marital relationship over the years, but they were together through struggles and successes for 51 years. After Chicago, Mack was offered a job in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, at the Cedar Rapids Republican newspaper, and he and Irene decided they would move to Cedar Rapids, and they did. And it was during this time, in fact, the apartment they were in, they could look out the window, Irene said, and they could see 5 Turner Alley. So it wasn't long after that that Mack got to know, I guess Iowa's most famous artist, Grant Wood. And once I read, and we have here some of the letters that Effie wrote, and in that one letter, Effie, Mack's mom, wrote that she had paid a visit to Grant Wood's studio and actually met Hattie, who was Grant Wood's mother. They really had a lot in common, and a friendship had developed between them also. Of course, a few years after this, after they met, that was when Grant was to create one of the world's most recognizable paintings, of course, in American Gothic. And kind of quite ironically, Mack, in the next 25 years, was going to create that wonderful Civil War novel. Now, during the time with Grant Wood, and some of you know this story, but they had a club here in town, and this was at a later time in which Mack was coming for a visit here in Iowa City, and it was called the Times Club. And it's the area above Prairie Lights is where they met, and kind of the I think it's more the restaurant area above Prairie Lights. And in order to be part of it all, Grant Wood wanted people to dress in disguise, and a picture was taken, because otherwise they couldn't become a member of the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Speakers. And so they have on these old-fashioned outfits. The other man, Mack, is the one with the full beard there on the right, but the other man is Thomas Duncan, who's living in Des Moines. He was also a novelist and a poet. And after the time in Cedar Rapids, Mack, the Gazette bought up the Republican, and Mack and Irene moved back to Webster City. They really had no place to go, and so they moved back in with the grandparents. Well, that didn't work very well, because living with his grandmother, Mack tried to work on a novel called Diversity, and every so often, and he jokes about it in some of his writings, his grandma would come in and say, Mack, look, Kitty caught a birdie. And of course, it was so distracting that he couldn't get anything done. So he had to move into an apartment with Irene. And that novel was his first novel that received really national recognition. Diversity is a street in Chicago, and that was really the beginnings of his work as a novelist. He had success, but always came back to Webster City for some events, and one of those happened in 1938. And he returned to Webster City because there were several mounds in the north part of the town that had always intrigued him. It was up on what they called Moines Street, north of the railroad tracks. And so he hired some workers that summer to dig up a couple of the mounds to see what were in them. Actually, the team was led by an archaeologist whose name was Mildred Mott, later becoming very famous in her field. And they did yield some. I've seen some of the pieces of ancient pieces. The Middle Woodland people, I think is what it was called. They've got some of the pieces in the Kendall Young Library. Now, Mildred Mott, the young woman that he employed as his archaeologist, was actually born in Marengo, Iowa, not far from here. And Mildred's father, Frank Luther Mott, was a journalism professor here at Iowa. And he was also, you know how these things all weave together, he was also a character in one of Grant Wood's paintings, the one he did for the book Moines Street in 1937. Frank Luther Mott was the booster in that particular one. Mack always seemed to take characters he had known from those first 25 years or so of his life, and he used them in a lot of his writings of short stories. This happens to be one of those. This was an explorer whose name was Carl Akley, and Carl came during Mack's senior year in high school on a speaking engagement. There's an interesting story there. The day I met the lion is what he called it. But in essence, Mack had been telling the classmates, because he had seen Carl Akley at the Field Museum in Chicago during a visit, he had been telling his classmates that, oh, I know him really well. You know, we're like this. We're good friends. And then he found out his senior year of the spring that he was coming to the school. And he thought, and the administration kind of thought he's probably not being legitimate with this. He probably didn't know him as well as he's saying. So they arranged to, Mack tried to get out of that assembly room, but they nabbed him. They brought him back and they said, oh, Dr. Akley, here's McKinley Kantor. You remember him, you know, they really set him up. And Dr. Akley paused for a minute and sensed what was going on. And he said, "Oh, yes, I remember you. Of course I do." And Mack, of course, had a lifelong respect for that. Unfortunately, Dr. Akley died a few years later from that point while he was doing some work in the Belgian Congo. And there was also, he wrote a short story called Her Name Was Grace, about his favorite teacher in high school. And that was Miss Bidlack, was her name, Miss Bidlack, and you see her here. Unfortunately, the kids called her Old Lady Bedslats. But nonetheless, even if they had a name for her, they had a lot of respect for her too. She was a good teacher, and at that time, of course, most of the teachers used corporal punishment, which she certainly did too. She had one that she called the merry-go-round, where she'd grab the boy and spin him around like this. In today's world, that would not happen. But she was later also the principal of one of the buildings. I love the way he described her, though. Mack had, as I said, a way with words, and he smilingly called her a disgruntled blacksmith masquerading in petticoats. And this was a family, an old family, the Brewer family and Bonebright family. That's old Granny right in the center here. They had restored one of the first log cabins in Webster City. And when she died in 1930, she was 93 years old. But he wrote a poem about her, and it's one of my favorite poems, so I'm going to share it with you today. This is what Mack wrote about Granny Bonebright. "Carry her out to the hillside and fold her calloused hands, and drag for her the boulder that rests upon her lands. A boulder torn from the river, her tall son dug it out, from its cold brown bed by the sandbar and the old elk's buried snout. The bones of buffalo knew it, her bones will know it now. May it shield her sleeping body as it shielded the bull and cow, and let the women who knew her tell their babies in the shade, this boulder touches a woman, this is her accolade. And when the cottonwood quiver in breath of a dark spring night, and the dome of the courthouse trembles alone with its little light, up from the creek of her father, the dead shall rise and walk, Wilson, Bell, and Billy to sit beside her and talk. They'll lean their guns in the maples, they'll stamp on the dark dead ground, and Granny will rise and curtsy to know that she has been found. They'll tell of 100 antlers and whisper of waiting Sioux, and she'll be ready to feed them before their telling is through. Past flower sky they'll be going, sad stars will see them tramp, down to the brook of the Brewers, down where the willows are damp. And only the dew will witness the tracks in a wet green chill, where the lean men beckoned to Granny, and Granny watched from her hill. Brassfield and Bell they have faded, Bonebright echoed away. The wolves have run from the briars, the prairie has turned to hay, and I cry to think of an hour in the crush of an aching dawn when I'll go back to that cabin with the last of the Brewers gone. And this is Mack in about 1950 at his typewriter. He never mastered typewriting. He used the three-finger method. And sometimes he typed so much in one setting that his fingers would bleed. He just couldn't stop typing. It wrapped him up, it consumed him. This, of course, is a cover of one of his books, Long Remember. This book got a lot of praise. It was about Gettysburg, and Mack used a really interesting technique, I think, in telling the story. It tells not of the soldiers on either side, but rather a man returning to Gettysburg who had grown up there. So it's just an interesting twist that I really enjoyed. Mack had actually grown up with the veterans of the Civil War. His grandfather knew many of them, and there were 11 ancestors on the Bone side of the family that had fought in the Civil War. So he had a lot of context there. He'd listened to all of their stories and knew them well. And they were, of course, old men there. They were in their 80s. But they would come at night and sit with Mack's grandfather to remember the war. Another book that he did was God and My Country. This was a novel from 1954, and he dedicated it to his scoutmaster, Murray McMurray. Of course, in this book, Lem Siddons was the scoutmaster. And again, another look at Mack at this time in his life. Well, he wrote blank verse for something that he called Glory for Me, and he later made it into a small book, and this became the basis for the movie The Best Years of Our Lives, which some of you are familiar with. The title actually came from a song, Glory for Me, came from a song that his mother used to play on the piano. The words were, "With all my labors and trials are o'er, and I am safe on the beautiful shore. Oh, what that will be glory for me." Well, Sam Goldwyn really didn't like that title at all, and he gave it the working title of Return for the Sword. 7 Oscars were given to The Best Years of Our Lives, including the Best Picture, and also an honorary Oscar and a memorial Oscar. It starred Virginia Mayo, Frederick Marsh, Myrna Loy, and of course there was Harold Russell, and that was the man that you remember from the story with no hands. It came to Webster City in 1947, and Mack was rather unhappy because they didn't give much credit to him in the credits for the movie. And here's a picture actually from the movie itself. A big movie with an impact on Webster City was one that he called Happy Land. And 20th Century Fox told the story of Rusty March and his tragic loss in the war. And it featured a drugstore theme. But word spread in Webster City that the movie would be filmed there. So a lot of letters were written. Even the Catholic priest in town wrote a letter to 20th Century Fox asking that they do film it there in 1943. The film was not. It didn't happen, and people were very disappointed. Actually, the main character there you can see was Don Amici, and Don Amici also had Iowa roots. He had attended Loras College, and I think he's buried in Dubuque now too. It was also the film debut of a young woman named Natalie Wood, and the film had its world premiere in Webster City in December of that year. One of the books or movies you might remember was Follow Me, Boys, based on Mack's remembrance of the Boy Scouts and its leader, Murray McMurray. Fred McMurray, who was no relation to the McMurrays in Webster City, was a man that played the scout leader. This was in 1966. It was a Disney movie, and it was actually the last production of a movie by Walt Disney because he died of lung cancer just 2 weeks after the movie's release. Other movies on Mack's books were The Romance of Rosie Ridge, Gun Crazy, The Voice of Bugle Ann. There was even one called Mountain Music, and that featured Martha Ray and was promoted with the following. It said in the ad, "A riot of singin', swingin', humdingin', hillbilly hilarity. Come on, folks, there's a fun feud a-brewin'." And Mack did take part in World War II as a correspondent. He actually claimed that he went up in planes and dropped some bombs over Germany. This rare photo is Jon Kantor. That's Mack's father. And he was, as I said, a man of many talents, but he really used all of his talents to harm rather than to help other people. He was in and out of Mack's life before Mack became an established writer. He was in and out of Sing Sing also, so he had a lot of problems going for him. Mack had very little respect for him. When Jon Kantor died, he said to the people admitting him to the hospital that my famous novelist son would pay for the hospital stay, and Mack declined. He would not pay for it. And this is one of many women in Jon Kantor's life. I mean, he was smooth in many ways, but this woman was one that is very well known because her name is Sophie Tucker. And Sophie Tucker promoted herself as the last of the Red Hot Mamas. And she also later on said that she too was swindled by Jon Kantor. And this, of course, is the cover for Andersonville. That prison was operated from February 1864 until the end of the Civil War. It was down in southwest Georgia. If you read it, you remember that it was run by Captain Wirtz, a Swiss man that was educated in Berlin. It came out in 1955, and Mack used 768 pages to write that novel and used over 340,000 words. And this is Mack at about the time that he was awarded the Pulitzer. He became kind of an overnight success in some ways, became very recognizable. Here he is in the suit, kind of in the center of this picture. It's an ad for a whiskey company. There was also another ad I noticed in one of Saturday Evening Post or Life in which it's for his Zippo lighter, because he always had a pipe. He doesn't appear in the other ad, just his lighter appears in it, and said he had used it so many times that it must be a good lighter. And this is a cover I mentioned earlier, the cover of Spirit Lake, that 1857 incident. This one was even larger than Andersonville. It's got 957 pages and over 500,000 words. And this was the cabin, one of the cabins that was associated with the Spirit Lake incident, and that's Abby Gardner Sharp, one of the 4 women that were taken captive by this renegade group of Sioux. Late in life, McKinley Kantor, along with his son Tim Kantor, did a book called Hamilton County. Kind of an interesting concept because they found the 10 Hamilton counties in the United States and did a photo essay on those 10 counties. Some very rural, some very urban. But Mack did the prose and Tim did the photography. And one of those photos appeared on the cover of Life magazine in July 1970. Webster City people were excited because these 3 boys were from Hamilton County in Iowa, and they were at the Scout Jamboree in a Boy Scout camp called Dolliver Park. Another later novel was a tribute to his wife Irene called I Love You Irene. It talked about that winter in 1927 when they were trying to live on $4 a week and getting through the cold in Webster City. Mack came back for the city's Centennial in 1957. Really for the last 30 or 40 years of his life, he was looked upon as the Webster City historian. So if you had any kind of an event, you called on Mack Kantor to come back, and Mack would come back. And here is Mack seated as he receives his honorary degree from Drake University. Now that must have pleased Mack very, very much because that was the university where his mom and dad had met. It was a university that his sister had graduated from. He also received an honorary degree from Iowa Wesleyan College down in Mount Pleasant. And at that time, Mack said the following. He said, "But in my own youth, I did not go to this college, nor to any college. I did not wish to attend college. Bitterly, I reacted to the circumstance of our family poverty, and as the son of a divorced woman, the son of a Jew, the son of a notorious confidence man and swindler, alternately I felt myself pillarized before the gaze of Webster City and set apart from the rest of mankind in a bog of degradation. College, I felt, was a situation acceptable and profitable to those who belonged. I did not belong." And this is Mack and his wife, Irene, a charming picture taken in Florida in January of 1950. In Webster City, just a year before McKinley Kantor died, both he and Clark Mullenhoff came back and they dedicated this lectern in the middle of what the local people in Webster City call their twin parks. And another shot of Mack as he aged. And I mentioned Murray McMurray. Murray made a trip towards the end of his life to go down and see McKinley Kantor in Florida at his home. As I said, Murray was kind of a father-like figure for Mack. He thought a lot of him. When Mack was a young boy, Murray was working. He was a young man, but he was working at his father's bank. And Mack said one time, I first saw Murray McMurray in 1909 in our native Webster City when I was 5. He said it was the same year that Lincoln pennies appeared. I displayed one, new and shiny, to one of my fellow kindergartners. That's nothing, said the other boy. Murray McMurray's got a whole pocket full, and he's giving them away to kids. And again, the dog that he loved. He wrote about some of them. He wrote about one dog named Lobo that he had when he was living for a period of time in Spain. And in his later years, when Mack and Irene would visit any of their friends that had a dog, he'd usually take meat along or soup bones along for the dog. And there was, he didn't write the novel, but Mack was asked to appear in one movie. And the movie was called Wind Across the Everglades. You might recognize this gentleman from The Sound of Music. But the other person that you're going to see is the judge. This is a video. So you'll see the judge, and the judge is McKinley Kantor. So you'll get a chance to see him. Mack had 2 children. I've mentioned Tim already. This was his daughter, Lane, and Carol Lane, actually, Kantor. She was born in 1928, and she died in 2009. Very well-educated woman. She obtained a law degree and worked for many years with disadvantaged youth. Tim was a writer and a novelist, the son. Now, Lane's son is named Tom Schroeder, and he's written several novels and edited many more. This shows Tim, the son, as a boy, and Mack is teaching Tim how to shoot the pistol. After his father's death, Tim wrote this book called My Father's Voice. It was a biography, and he tells many of the stories about his dad. He was sometimes, I feel, rather brutally honest in the book, but it is well written, and it gives us another look at the family dynamics of the Kantors. When the Empire State Building was built, they had lights on the top of it, and they called them Freedom Lights. And McKinley Kantor was asked to write a poem that appeared in the foyer at the bottom, and a lot of people are not aware of that. I'm not sure whether that is still there, that plaque is still there or not, but it was placed there on May 3rd, 1956. The lights have now been replaced by newer tower lighting systems. Mack came back to Webster City, and in 1973, they held a reception for him at the library that they call the Author's Day, and it was also the 50th anniversary of his high school graduation class. So a lot of his classmates from those early days were there, and he announced that he was working on his last novel at that time, a novel called Valley Forge. Well, Mack Kantor, he truly rushed at life with open arms, I think, but the telltale signs of excess seemed to show on his face as he aged. Years of pipe smoking and years of excessive alcohol had certainly taken their toll on Mack. He asked to be buried back in his hometown of Webster City, and that is where he's buried. He and Irene are on one side of this stone, a stone that was found down in Brewer Creek by the town itself, and on the other side of the stone are the McKinleys, his maternal grandparents. And Mack chose his own epitaph, singer of songs, teller of tales, forever walking free. And Forever Walking Free was actually the name of one of his short stories about war and the death of the young in the military. Irene's is right next to him. I don't have a photo of Irene Stone, but because of McKinley Kantor's booming voice and personality, Irene once said that her memoirs might be entitled, "I Learned to Shout." She died doing what she loved best. She actually had a stroke. She was a painter. She had a stroke with a paintbrush in her hand when she went down. And this is one of Irene's paintings, a painting of her husband, McKinley Kantor. And this, most of his life, most of their life, Mack and Irene lived outside of Sarasota, Florida. And this is a picture of his office. You can see the prized magazine covers and photographs on the wall. It has since been torn down. It is not there now. But he always kept in this office 3 things from Hamilton County. He kept a town plat map of the town of Webster City. He kept a township map of Hamilton County, and he kept his grandfather's pocket watch in a little bell glass on his desk. And some people have asked, well, did you have any connection with McKinley Kantor? Well, I did meet him at book signing, but it was to shake his hand and say hello. That was it. But I had another connection. The tall woman there in the dress that goes down to her ankles, that's my grandmother. Her name was Grandmother Blue. Her last name was Blue. It was my mother's mother, and she was the eldest of a family of 8. So when she was 14 or so, she went off to work. And she became now we would call a governess, but basically a housekeeper for a family named Bale. And the Bale family were real close with the Kantor and McKinley family. In fact, later on, and they came from Galena, and they were good friends. The Bales were good friends with the family of the Ulysses S. Grant also. But while my grandma was working for them, they moved to Winnipeg, Canada. And she went along, and the young girls are standing there. They were just moving in that day. Well, I had several postcards of the Bales. I think that what he wrote, I think his story was called, "Can the Bale Girls Come Out and Play?" was his short story about them. But I sent those to him in about 73 or 74. And he said, he wrote me back, McKinley Kantor did, and he said right away, "Oh, I remember your grandma." He said when Florence Bale would come back to Webster City and I was ever coming through, she stayed at your grandmother's house. And I said, well, I knew that. She stayed upstairs. And he said, well, you know, your grandmother was really opposed to alcohol. No alcohol would come through that door. But Florence loved to have a little nip at night. So he said I had to sneak it up, and your grandmother wouldn't even allow the empty bottle to be placed in the wastepaper basket. So he shared that with me, and I'm pleased about that. When I think about McKinley Kantor, I think about that story too. And that is the program for today. I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
I read Andersonville a few years ago and really, really recommend it. You don't want to read a book about a prison camp with such a horrible reputation, but it's well worth it. And there's some Iowa characters in it. His research was meticulous. And it's done in kind of interesting vignettes. So while you feel like you're going to have to slog through this 700-page novel, the structure is such that it really is quite doable and worth it. My question is, so historians now look at what happened at Spirit Lake with a lot more nuance, understanding the tensions that were happening and what was happening to the Native American tribe or the band of Sioux, and looking at that with more understanding. So how does Kantor deal with that in the book? Is it more what the 1950s told us to think about it? Okay.
I think then the current way to look at it. He actually starts a lot of that here near Webster City. It was a place where the Boone River meets the Des Moines River, and there was a woman killed there named Mrs. Lott, who was supposedly the daughter of an early Pennsylvania governor. And then this group of renegade Sioux, they moved on up into Humboldt County, and Lott followed them there. Cinnamon Dota, I think, was the name of the man. And he went into the lodge and he saw some of the silver that had her initials on it. So Lott knew that this was the group that had caused the death of his wife back in Webster County. And then he killed all of those people and stuffed their bodies into a creek there. And he was a relative of Incapaduta, and Incapaduta was the one then that carried out the problems. They were starving at that point. They were looking for food, and so there were a lot of complications to that. That's for sure. Andersonville, though, I will mention that too. Really, it was during World War II. McKinley Kantor was at one of the concentration camps within 2 weeks of it being liberated. And that was the point in which he said, I'm going to write about Andersonville. He made that connection, and he used that connection. As I said it before, the smells, the sights, he used that connection to do Andersonville.
You're watching City Channel 4. On TV, online, on demand, on Facebook, and now on the go on your mobile device.